The world of MMA has its fair share of frauds, phonies, and fake gurus. However, few are as hated as Joshua Fabia. Fabia came into the spotlight largely due to his association with one of the sport's most beloved warriors, Diego Sanchez. A fighter known for his heart, determination, and fighting spirit. Despite not having either the competence or credentials to do so, Fabia was Sanchez's only coach for multiple years across 4 UFC fights. From using absurd training methods to filling Sanchez's head with crazy conspiracies, Fabia selfishly used Sanchez to inflate his ego and further cultivate his phony self-help guru facade. This video tells the heartbreaking story of how Joshua Fabia, a professional conman and cult leader, took advantage of Diego Sanchez at a particularly vulnerable time of his life and used him to further his own interest, all while destroying Sanchez's career, ruining his personal life, and further jacking up his mental health. Chapter 1: The Dream and the Nightmare. Diego Sanchez is undoubtedly a UFC and MMA legend. Though he may not have won a world title, he may not have dominated divisions or became a superstar, his sheer impact on the sport of MMA and the UFC specifically is undeniable. From winning the first Ultimate Fighter back in 2005, a pivotal event that saved the UFC from bankruptcy, to putting on some of the most entertaining fights fans had ever seen, like his legendary fight against Clay Guida, which was also inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. Diego Sanchez had an amazing career in the UFC spanning over 15 years. With his historic win in the Forest Ultimate Fighter tournament, Diego Sanchez also put his gym on the map, the Jackson Wink MMA Academy. Diego Sanchez continued to train in the same camp for most of his career with teammates like John Bones Jones, Holly Holm, BJ Penn, and Rashad Evans. However, by the end of his days in the Jackson Wink MMA Academy, Sanchez started to feel neglected in his own camp, with the focus shifting to more successful and younger fighters. By this time, Father Time was starting to catch up to Sanchez, and though the UFC was happy to keep giving the aging legend more fights as long as he wanted, other incidents in his personal life, along with him being at the end of his prime, put him in a rather vulnerable mental state. A state that vultures like Joshua Fabia know all too well how to exploit. Chapter 2: Into the Fabia-verse. Like any other con man or snake oil salesman out there is a lot of verifiable information about Fabia online. Everything he says and everything written about him on his School of Self-Awareness website is purposely vague. As far as we know from his interviews and writings, Fabia was brought up in Filipino martial arts, trained by his grandfather who was in the Philippine Army and a Vietnam veteran. Though these claims seem to be true, many of his other claims are more doubtful, to say the least. In his bio from his School of Self-Awareness website, Fabia boasts that when he was only 9 years old, he successfully acted as a physical therapist for his grandfather, who had suffered from a heart attack and ruptured brain aneurysm. He boasted that he was able to get his grandfather to, and I quote, remarkable 85% full recovery. Personally, this statement made me laugh a little bit and reminded me of that dialogue by Paul Rudd in Anchorman, which goes something like, 60% of the time, it works every time. In the same bio, Fabia claims that he has an innate understanding of the human body along with specialized experience in defense, protection, human rights, and physical therapy. Well, he sounds like a man of many talents. That isn't all. If you take a look at some of the promotional, or in other words, propaganda videos put out by the School of Self-Awareness, Fabia is painted like a messiah, or modern day prophet who is loved and feared by thousands of people around the world. However, the truth is that Fabia is a man with a massive ego and what seems like a low self-esteem. I'm pretty sure he actually believes that he is some end of times prophet, and he is doing the world a favor by simply existing and enlightening others with his ideology. He has no talent, he has no credentials, and it seems like he has no empathy for others either. Yet what he does have is a mastery of manipulation. Chapter 3: the nightmare outside the cage. Diego the Nightmare Sanchez was known for his intense stand and bang fighting style. He was relentless, aggressive, and violent inside the cage, embodying his nickname as he perceived himself as a nightmare for his opponents. However, it was Sanchez's personal life that became an actual nightmare for him. Despite his fighting style, Diego Sanchez was also known as a kind-hearted, easygoing guy outside the cage. This disposition, while endearing, perhaps made him too susceptible to exploitation. His whole experience with Fabia wasn't the first time Sanchez was scammed. Back in 2009, a few months after his legendary fight against Clay Guida, Sanchez found out that one of his friends, whom he had trusted to manage his finances, had stolen over $150,000 from him. This, combined with his excessive partying and drinking, put Sanchez in a serious financial hole and started to impact his performances inside the cage as well. Sanchez was motivated to turn his life around when he found out that he had fathered a child with a woman that he had slept with. After taking one look at the child, he was convinced that he was the father, and he took full responsibility for him and his mother. This was a massive emotional turning point in Sanchez's life, as his new responsibility forced him to take his career even more seriously and changed his life for the better. Well, unfortunately, things got even worse for his mental state when he found out that the woman had straight up lied and the child wasn't even his. This was especially heartbreaking for Sanchez. It absolutely crushed him emotionally and opened the doors for even more turmoil in his personal life. Fast forward to 2019 with his prime past him and him taking a lot of damage in his fights, Diego's wife pushed him to retire since she did not want to see him get hurt. Being in the mindset that he was in, Diego instead pushed his wife away, thinking that she just didn't believe in him anymore. This eventually led to their divorce. Like any con man worth his salt, Joshua Fabia came into Diego Sanchez's life at the perfect moment when he was the most vulnerable and the most susceptible to a manipulative mastermind who told him what he wanted to hear and got his claws in deep. Chapter 4. Fabia and Sanchez, a match made in hell. Fabia met Diego Sanchez 10 days before his fight against Mickey Gale. He became a much needed friend to Sanchez and worked with him a little bit. However, in the last 10 days of the camp, almost all of the work was already put in by Sanchez's experienced coaches at Jackson Wink Academy. With Fabia contributing barely anything to the preparation, he was only 10 days from his fight. The whole camp was pretty much completed at that point. Still, when Sanchez knocked out Mickey Gale and won the Performance of the Night bonus, Fabia did not miss the opportunity to take credit for his win, even though he had only worked with Sanchez for the last 10 days of the camp, and he wasn't even in his corner.
That in the last 3 fights, the first one that I'm involved in is the best fight he's had in 10 years.
After the fight, Diego Sanchez left Jackson Wink and essentially fired his entire team, letting Fabia take over his sole coach, trainer, nutritionist, physical therapist, and manager. Over the following months, Fabia started to take control of more and more aspects of Sanchez's life under the guise of helping and supporting him as a friend. Moving forward, Diego's life started to get even worse, both in terms of his fighting career and his mental state outside of the cage. Fabia cornered Sanchez for his next 3 fights, in which Sanchez looked the worst he had his entire career. He showed up extremely out of shape, didn't seem to have any serious game plan, and at times looked like he was using some weird, force-filled techniques. Sanchez lost 2 out of 3 fights with Fabia in his corner, and the only one he did win was through disqualification after he took an illegal knee from Michael Pereira. Through the beginning of the Fabia era in Sanchez's life, most fans didn't care much about the situation. It was Diego Sanchez being Diego Sanchez. However, as he progressed, fans started to notice how Fabia was taking over Sanchez's life and just straight up using him. Fabia slowly became the most hated man in the MMA community after facing backlash by fans and analysts alike for his reckless training method, like chasing fighters around a cage with a sharp knife in his hand, and his borderline stupid corner advice.
I need it. I need that Tyson.
Joshua went on sort of a media campaign. He talked to several prominent MMA analysts and journalists like Ariel and Luke Thomas, and he appeared on multiple podcasts. As expected, Fabia made an absolute fool of himself in most of these interviews. Between the self-agonizing speeches and his spiritual mumbo-jumbo, he made enough time to push his absurd conspiracy theories, like accusing Joe Rogan of launching a smear campaign against him.
Be interesting, Joe Rogan talking that about me saying 100. Maybe you should ask what it means.
Another interview with John Morgan from MMA Junkie, he went a step further and accused the UFC of using bots and other strategies to promote negative content against him. After all this drama with Fabia, along with several other weird altercations, it seemed like the UFC was still willing to work with Sanchez, so they signed a contract with him, giving him a retirement fight against fellow UFC legend and former teammate Donald Cowboy Cerrone. Before the fight, Sanchez and Joshua appeared on the Real Quick podcast with Mike Swick. This was one of the most interesting interviews done by the pair and really showed the kind of effect that Fabia had on Sanchez. Mike Swick is an old friend of Sanchez going back to the first Ultimate Fighter, where both were roommates. As the interview starts, you can clearly notice Sanchez's body language and demeanor when he talks about the good old days in the Ultimate Fighter house. You can see that he is happy and energetic. However, that all changes when Fabia starts to talk in the middle of the interview. For the most part, the conversation and the interviews remain quite straightforward. They talk about several topics like the fight against Cowboy, the upcoming tournaments, Diego's retirement, and his move to American Top Team for the last fight. However, as the conversation continues, Diego starts to get into some weird topics like the fake internet and UFC employed bots used to slander him and his coach Fabia. Granted, internet bots, those are a real thing, but the way Diego was talking about them, making analogies to wizards and puppets and even magic, seemed quite unhinged. In fact, it seemed like they are Fabia's words just coming out of Diego's mouth. Still, that was nothing compared to the absolute mindless rant that Fabia went on after taking over the interview. If you look at the moment Fabia starts to speak, there is a clear shift in Sanchez's demeanor. The smile on his face fades away and he becomes like a subservient follower. It is truly sad to see a devious person like Fabia have such an effect on a fighter the MMA fans love. Putting that aside, this part of the interview is hard to sit through. Joshua continues to rant for almost an hour about an array of absurd and nonsensical ideas, which I can't even begin to explain in this video. Just to give you a rough idea, he starts the game with a lesson in breathing, mentions things like the golden ratio, and goes into ideas like Asian people having better physical dexterity since they use squat toilets. Somehow he also takes the conversation to Buddhist monks who burned themselves to protest the Vietnam War, being the avid human rights activist that he is. All in all, this interview is amazing. It may make you want to bang your head against the wall, but it is fun to watch Fabia spew junk straight out of his mouth and self-destruct himself. Moving on, now that Sanchez had a good retirement fight lined up, which could have definitely been a good and much needed payday for him, and with him training at the American Top Team, things were looking a little better for him, at least from a career standpoint. But of course, as expected, Fabia, the self-absorbed fanatic, had to ruin this for Sanchez and, well, make everything about himself. A few days before the fight against Cerrone, the UFC announced that the fight was cancelled from Sanchez's side and that he was being released by the UFC, also being paid both the show and win money for the fight. Following this, Fabia released an audio recording of him talking with the UFC, which shed light on why the fight was actually cancelled. It seemed like Fabia was getting ready to sue the UFC, and being the absolute moron that he is, he demanded that the UFC release all of Sanchez's prior medical records, along with a list of every doctor who worked on him. The medical record of a fight is managed by the concerned commission where the fight takes place and not the UFC, but Fabia didn't know that. Also, what did he think that the UFC was going to put Sanchez in a fight when his camp is clearly making claims about long-term damage to their fighter? So the fight was cancelled and Diego had to part ways with the UFC in a rather anticlimactic manner. Around this time, old videos of Fabia punching Diego in the face while he was hanging upside down resurfaced. This infuriated MMA fans who found the idea that Fabia was concerned with Sanchez's brain health was absolutely absurd when he was using these idiotic training methods like chin conditioning with punches with Sanchez. Luckily, in the aftermath of all of this, we received some good news, and it seemed like the Fabia-Sanchez match made in hell was finally deteriorating. Sanchez joined the professional athlete's brain health study, and about a week later, he announced on his Instagram that he had ended his partnership with Joshua Fabia. Sanchez remained silent about the split for the most part, but Fabia, well, he acted just like we thought he would, and he wasn't so polite about the situation. Chapter 5, The Aftermath. Joshua Fabia claimed that he was the one who broke ties with Sanchez, and he went on to badmouth his former student and friend like an angry ex-girlfriend. He said that Sanchez had some, quote, asshole celebrity tendencies, and didn't like to tip people. He claimed that Sanchez was an addict, and he, out of the goodness of his heart, stayed with him and acted as his sponsor, helping him get better. To make things worse, he even delved more into his conspiracy theories and accused Sanchez of actually throwing the fight against Michael Chiesa. The final cherry on top was when he claimed that Sanchez went to the special school as a child, which was a red flag as he wasn't a normal person. This guy is very unapologetic, and I think he deserved a lot worse than what he got. As for Sanchez, he had a couple of fights since, one in Eagle FC against Kevin Lee, and one in the Bare Knuckle FC. Unfortunately, he lost both of these fights, and this is the story of Diego Sanchez and Joshua Fabia. It definitely was an emotional roller coaster. One thing that I thought was very interesting about this whole scenario is this is the fight game. It's not like any other sport where you can somehow get away with faking it. This is fighting. You can't fake it. When you're out there in the ring or on the mats, wherever you are, and it's just you versus your opponent, there's no faking it. You completely get exposed if you haven't been doing the right training, haven't been eating right. All that stuff comes out. There is no faking it in the fight game. So I'm not surprised that he eventually got exposed for all of this weird tactics and his just general fakeness. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you guys for watching. If you're into anything MMA, jiu-jitsu, all of that, I document it on this channel. So please hit that sub button. Every last one counts. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next one.